Welcome to the Let's Talk About Applying Intersectionality in Public Health. This is a two-part webinar series brought to you by the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health. My name is Pemma Muzumdar. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the daughter of people who immigrated to Canada from India, and I'm a mother of two. I'm also a knowledge translation specialist at the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health, which is located in what is now known as Antigonish, Nova Scotia, in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties do not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognize Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and establish the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. While I am speaking on behalf of a center located in Mi'kma'ki, what is now known as Nova Scotia, I am physically located in Tshilhqot'in, known as Montreal, on the unceded lands and waters of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabeg. Recently, I've been learning more about exactly who was colonized here, and I've learned that slavery was established in what is now known as Quebec, where I live, through a royal mandate by Louis XIV in 1689, and that in the years that followed, including when those treaties of peace and friendship were signed in Mi'kma'ki, Black people were either enslaved or fleeing from being enslaved in what we now know as Nova Scotia. And what's more, slavery was only abolished in the British Empire, including what's now known as Canada, in 1834. So for me, understanding this history of racial and colonial violence and how these systems, together with other systems of oppression, manifest harm for Black and Indigenous people in distinct and significant ways is important. I think it's actually a key part of understanding what it means to take an intersectional or intersectionality-informed approach to public health work in Canada. The center that I represent, the NCCDH, supports the public health community to address both structural and social determinants of health. And this is to bring about, at a societal level, improved population health and reduced inequities. You might also be interested to learn about the other NCCs for public health, each of whom work across Canada in different theme areas. And you can learn more about the NCC program at nccph.ca. I'm really delighted to be presenting today with Bernice Yanful. You'll see her picture coming up here on the next slide. I had the pleasure of writing the Let's Talk Intersectionality with Bernice. You may know her also as the voice of our NCCDH podcast, Mind the Disruption, for which I am a big fan. I particularly enjoy listening while I'm cooking or doing various chores, especially laundry. Lots of laundry when you have two kids. Bernice is a registered nurse and PhD candidate in the Dalalana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, whose food system research spans several disciplinary boundaries, including public health, education, geography, and nutrition. Prior to beginning her doctoral studies, Bernice worked as a public health nurse in Ontario. Hi, Bernice.
Hi, Pemma, and hi to all of you who are joining us today. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be part of this presentation. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. So I'm also a knowledge translation specialist with NCCDH. I joined the center this past September, and I'm also the daughter of Ghanaian immigrants, and I currently reside and work in Toronto, home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island.
Thanks, Bernice. So on the next slide here, you'll see our objectives. We've designed our webinar today with the intention of supporting you to describe what is meant by intersectionality, its historical roots, its relevance to public health, and to consider when intersectionality is being misused, and also, of course, to access the resources that can support your learning about what it means to take an intersectoral approach. I'm going to turn it over to Bernice, and she's going to lead us through some interactive polls. Always good to get started with some polls.
Great. So for our first poll, you can join at slido.com, and the code is as noted there on the slide. So it's 69479078. And I believe a colleague is also putting that in the chat box. For our first poll question, we'd love to hear a word you associate with intersectionality. So prior to coming to the session today, what is one word that comes to mind when you think of intersectionality? And Slido will generate a word cloud for us. And we'll give you a minute or so to complete that. Great, that's awesome. So we're seeing lots of participation in the Slido itself, as well as in our chat box. So I see words like equity, Black feminism, on the Slido and the word cloud, lots of responses related to diversity, identity, complexity, collaboration, discrimination. Absolutely, so we'll definitely be touching on all of those things today. Okay, we'll give it another second or so. Great, thank you so much for those responses. Why don't we move to our second poll? So part of the webinar today is a focus on understanding what intersectionality is. So I'm curious, before you came to this session, how would you answer that question? So intersectionality is about, how would you complete that sentence? Is it about identifying different social identities, understanding how personal characteristics such as gender or race overlap to inform experiences, how systems of power and oppression work together to differently impact people based on their multiple social positions or identities, or all of the responses? So we'll give you a minute or so to complete that question. Wonderful. So about 78% of people who participate in the poll said all of the responses. We have about 15% for how different systems of power and oppression work together, understanding personal characteristics, about 6%, and then 1% selected identifying different social identities. So now I'm going to pass it off to Pemma, who will be diving more into that question of what is intersectionality.
Thank you, Bernice. Yeah, I loved seeing those responses come in. Great to see where our thinking is at on this topic. So what is intersectionality? So I'm not going to give you the correct answer to the poll just yet, and let's see if we can come up with it together after this section. Intersectionality emerged from the ideas debated in critical race theory, which is a framework that sees racism as a systemic problem embedded in legal structures and institutions, rather than simply being about individual bias. Intersectionality is notoriously difficult to define. It can be a concept, framework, approach, analytical strategy, and/or movement for social justice. It considers the ways that systems of power and oppression, so racism, ableism, classism, sexism, heteronormativity, are interwoven. It asks how these multiple systems, when they're interwoven, influence people's well-being differently based on their social positions and identities. And importantly, it calls for action on multiple oppressive systems that drive systemic inequity. And as an aside, we don't have time to go too deep into critical race theory in this webinar, but if you're already familiar with it a little bit, if you want to know more about it and how it can be applied in public health, I do encourage you to check out some of the links that I'm going to ask my colleague to drop into the chat box. And you can also, I would really encourage you to listen to the past 2 recordings of our webinar series with the Black Health Education Collaborative on anti-Black racism and public health. And those are available on our website as well. We're going to play you Kimberly sharing the metaphor of intersectionality it relates to a road intersection. And there are many different metaphors. Different metaphors resonate with us as people. And so you might have heard about another great metaphor for intersectionality. Feel free to share it in the chat box. And I'll mention a few others after we hear this clip.
Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped. experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique.
If you want to watch that video in its entirety, and it does have closed captions that you can enable, to watch later, it is available on YouTube, and we're going to throw the link in the chat box for you. Thanks so much. So here is another, I mentioned other web metaphors, and I'll just quickly name them here, because I think that metaphors do help some of us to imagine and to think about what is intersectionality. So there is also a metaphor that Kimberly Crenshaw talks about in her early writings, and that is a basement. And that's a crowded basement that's so densely packed with people that they're standing on each other's shoulders. And that basement contains all of the people experiencing systemic disadvantage due to their race, sex, class, sexual preference, age, physical ability. And on the floor above the basement ceiling were those who did not experience such systemic disadvantage. And Crenshaw describes a hatch which only some people, because of their position, because of where they were, because of their muscle capacity or ability to push themselves up, were able to squeeze themselves through. And that then they would get into that first floor where disadvantage was less present. And more recently, there were two authors, Maria Rodo-Zerati and Marta Jorba, who proposed a new metaphor, and that was the basket of apples. And here the authors make diverse social positions analogous to diverse properties of different apples. So flavor, texture, color, size. I could go on. I'll ask my colleague, but then I get hungry. So I'll ask my colleague to share some links with you for further reading about these metaphors. And again, if any of these resonate more for you than others, or if you've heard about another, or if you have any big, wonderful critique you'd like to share, there's quite a bit of critique in the literature as well. Do feel free to do so. You can also engage with us by emailing us and starting a discussion about this. We're sort of thinking about metaphors for intersectionality in general as we progress with this work. And we'd love it to discuss it with you. So this diagram here also I find helpful to frame intersectionality as a lens with which to understand and ultimately address structural inequality or inequity, as we tend to use in Canada. In the UK, they use that inequality word in a bit more of an inequity sense. And so in this way, it's clear that intersectionality fits with the public health intentions to take an equity-centered approach to address health inequities. Differences in health, of course, by inequities, we mean differences in health that are systemic, avoidable, unfair. And for me, both of Kimberly Crenshaw's metaphors, both that intersection, crossroads, multiple systems, and also the basement work for me. But they have their limitations. And so this figure, I think, helps me to add in some of that complexity, that it is multiple systems of structures and power that shape, along with those interconnected social categories, shape an experience of structural inequality. Next slide, please. Thanks so much. So in reviewing the evidence within that Let's Talk Intersectionality, we landed on an intersectionality as maintaining that life is complex and multidimensional, that intersectionality says that identity is not static but dynamic in relation to context, that systems of power and oppression are interconnected and mutually reinforcing, or the word that you'll see in a lot of the literature is co-constitutive, and that people can be systemically privileged or disadvantaged and disadvantaged. It's an either and an and or piece by others at the same time. So by other systems at the same time, I should say. So to use a personal example, I do not experience racism, sexism, education privilege, and class privilege separately in like different streams that don't interact with each other. Rather, as an educated, employed, brown Canadian woman, I experience racialized sexism and gendered racism. And we have another core idea slide next that takes us into what we mean by an intersectionality approach. And we are going to get into what we mean by taking an intersectionality approach even more in our second webinar, which is on May 3rd. But and you can register for that. We're going to put the link in the chat box as well if you haven't already. But just briefly here, I'll say that even though I've hinted at the fact that a faithful application of intersectionality prioritizes the pursuit of social justice and disrupts systems of oppression that create inequities, I want to add that taking an intersectionality approach also means centering and engaging with those who experience marginalization because of multiple interlocking systems. For example, racialized trans people. So we can move over to the next slide. Sometimes, as much as it can be helpful to know what intersectionality is, I find it can also be helpful to clearly say what it is not. And this is the part that might surprise some of you, because it really is the term is misused quite often. And it's nothing to be, ashamed of, it's just to become more aware of. So the authors of a report from the Poverty and Inequality Commission in Scotland did this nicely, and I thought that their summary was really useful, so I included it here. Intersectionality is not a synonym for diversity. So it's important to avoid terms like I'm an intersectional person, or this is an intersectional group, or the intersectionality of things. Rather, intersectionality is an actual approach, and we mentioned that in previous slides. So to frame it as a specific approach, and if you're going to use intersectional, like what we might mean by intersectional person, it might be more helpful to say something like, I belong to multiple different social categories, or my experience is at the intersection of this and this, rather than to sort of use it in a way that sounds like you're talking about intersectionality, the approach. Intersectionality is also not a tool for understanding identity, which is why it's important to, I should say, it's not a tool for merely understanding identity. So it's important to avoid terms and phrases like, sorry, that's already what I just said. It's important to avoid focusing on intersecting categories of identity and sort of doing so in a way that doesn't also then pull in how multiple systems work together to shape experiences of inequity or inequality. Intersectionality is not additive. It's not about sex plus disability plus class. And I kind of mentioned that a little bit when I was talking about the way that my experience of structural inequality is shaped as an educated, brown, racialized woman who experiences racialized sexism. So it's not additive. And this is why, again, I personally do not find it helpful to begin discussions that are supposed to be about intersectionality with one of those privilege exercises. And you may know the kind I'm referring to. This is like when you're asked to add 1 for being a white person, and to add another 1 if you've completed a university degree, -1 if you're a woman, add another one if you're cisgendered, and the exercise goes on. And these exercises can be useful and likely do have a place and a utility, but they're more useful to personally reflect on your own privilege rather than to frame a larger discussion about the meaning and application of intersectionality as an approach or as a concept. So intersectionality, finally, is also not competitive. It's not about pitting one systemically disadvantaged group against another. Similarly, it's not hierarchical. It's not about one form of oppression being higher up on some, like it's more important to your life than another. And so I'll just pause it here and turn it back over to Bernice for our next poll.
Great. And we had a question in the chat that we might want to take a moment to address now. So we were asked to explain why intersectionality cannot be used to understand identity. So I believed you said it cannot just be about that, but did you want to expand on that, Pemma?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the only thing that I would say to expand on it is that if it's used to understand personal identity in a way that is divorced from the experience of multiple oppressive structures working together in a way that it's not like this structure plus this structure comes together like this. If I make a visual out of it, it's like my hands would turn into a whole different thing. It's like they become something new. And so those two or more oppressive systems working together shape my identity. And I'm using my and I statements here, shape my identity and my experience of structural inequality in an important way. And oftentimes intersectionality is used only to discuss identity. So I'm this kind of person, I belong to these different social categories. And that is not intersectionality. It was never meant to be about who an individual is without a larger discussion on systemic disadvantage and how to disrupt that oppression. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think related to that response, we had another question about, so intersectionality cannot be reduced to identity. That's essentially what you're saying, right? It cannot be reduced to individual identities.
Yeah, I mean, that can be one interpretation of what I would say, sure.
Did you want to expand on that, Pemma?
No, I think that it cannot be reduced to identity, but the emphasis is on systems. The emphasis is on systems and how systems work together and shape experience of structural inequality.
Okay, great. So we'll move forward, but we will have some significant time at the end to answer some more questions. So we would love to hear from you about things that perhaps require clarification, things that you're reflecting on, that you want to learn more about. And we'll definitely save some time at the end for further discussion. So now we're going to be moving into a bit of a discussion about the history of intersectionality and its origins. So before we do that, we have our next poll question. We would love to hear from you about what you believe to be the origins of intersectionality. Would you say it's from Black feminist thought and activism, the 1974 Lalonde Report, French socialism, or German philosophy? Great. So the vast majority of you who responded selected Black feminist thought and activism, about 88% of you. And we believe that an understanding of the roots of intersectionality and where it came from is essential for a faithful application of intersectionality. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the roots of intersectionality and how it's evolved over time. So by some accounts, we can go back all the way to the 19th century to identify the roots of intersectionality in Black feminist thought and activism. One of the earliest known expressions of some of intersectionality's core ideas was in Sojourner Truth's was in Sojourner Truth's 1851 speech, commonly known as Ain't I a Woman? Sojourner Truth was a women's rights activist who was born into slavery and escaped into freedom in the 1820s. And in her famed speech delivered at a women's rights convention in Ohio, my apologies. So in her famed speech delivered in Ohio, Truth highlighted the racialized and gendered experiences of Black women who were often excluded and ignored in the women's rights movements at the time. So essentially what we want you to get from this part is that even though intersectionality is coined as a term much later on, its roots in terms of its core ideas and tenets have a much longer history. And throughout the 1970s and 80s, Black, Latina, Indigenous, and Asian feminist activists and scholars further contributed to the development of intersectionality as both an intellectual and political project. For example, a group of Black feminists known as the Combahee River Collective released a statement in 1977 that described how various forms of oppression based on race, sex, sexual orientation, and class are interwoven and shaping daily experiences. And their statement also asserted their commitment to struggling together for liberation. In 1989, that's believed to be when the term intersectionality was coined by Black legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. We played a clip from her earlier on in the session. So she's widely credited with coining that term. In her landmark paper called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, she demonstrated the inadequacies of narrow single issue analyses of discrimination. So she used several court cases as well as the feminist and anti-racism movements of the time as examples, illustrating how Black women and their experiences are often misunderstood, excluded, or even theoretically erased when discrimination is understood as happening only within a single category at a time. For example, either based on race or sex, rather than both being together. So for example, she wrote about a lawsuit brought against General Motors in the 1970s. In 1976, 5 Black women sued General Motors for discrimination, alleging that their seniority policy targeted Black women exclusively. Because General Motors did not hire Black women prior to 1964, when seniority-based layoffs were subsequently implemented during a recession, all the Black women were let go because they had been employed by GM for the least amount of time. However, the court ruled in favor of the defendant, rejecting, as Crenshaw writes, the plaintiff's attempts to bring a suit not on behalf of Blacks or on behalf of women, but specifically on behalf of Black women. So the court diminished the claim of sex discrimination as they argued that General Motors had long hired women, even though Black women had been excluded from that. And they also dismissed claims of racial discrimination. So essentially, as Crenshaw demonstrates, the court failed to acknowledge that Black women could encounter discrimination based on race and sex working together simultaneously. And so in her paper, she demonstrates the importance of an intersectional analysis to understand how communities, groups, populations can experience simultaneously different systems of power and oppression, producing disadvantage and privilege. So since the 2000s, intersectionality has ballooned in popularity. In 2015, it was included as a word in the Oxford English Dictionary. However, in becoming more popular and traveling beyond its original context, it has also often been weaponized as a tool to invoke fear of social upheaval and chaos. So for example, just to read a few headlines that have popped up recently related to intersectionality, there has been, for example, a headline that states, "Is intersectionality the biggest problem in America? Intersectionality pushes political hot button. Is this a real college class? Beyonce and intersectionality." And also, intersectionality means the more kind of minority points that you have, the more privileged you are. Next slide, please. Here are some other headlines, and now Pemma is going to expand further on the uses and misuses of intersectionality using an example from Quebec.
Thanks. So yeah, I'll just give you a second to take in what you're seeing here. There's so much in the news right now, and it has been over the past few years about this topic. All right, we can move to the next slide. Thanks. I'm going to read you this quotation because it just sticks with me, and so I found it really powerful. Since intersectionality has its roots in radical resistance politics, particularly in Black feminist, critical race, and women of color theorizing and praxis, these origins and histories are relevant rather than immaterial to how intersectionality as a disposition has been misread, resisted, and misused, whether overtly or inadvertently. And that's from Vivian May's Pursuing Intersectionality, Unsettling Dominant Imaginaries. You'll see the reference there. So I'll just move to the, sorry, actually, if you can stay here, I forgot to share that example of Quebec. I wanted to read this quotation first because for me, as I mentioned, it's really powerful. It helps to contextualize why it's so important to get intersectionality right and to take a closer look at who is misunderstanding it. Bernice mentioned that sort of weaponization. So who is misusing it, and how is it being used to potentially cause harm, to contribute to the erasure of important experiences of systemic oppression and power. Both here in Canada, as you saw some of the headlines mentioned, and in the United States. And this larger societal context has always been relevant to public health. It will always be relevant to public health because larger values and the discourse affect how in public health we are able to take up and really get buy-in on different issues as well. And so I thought it was important to look at that larger context and also to share what's happening right now in Quebec. One of the headlines that you saw on the previous slide was related to this. A few weeks ago, ahead of International Women's Day, the Quebec government, the Coalition Avenir de Québec, or the CAQ, was asked by another party, the Québec Solidaire, to formally adopt an intersectional approach to feminism. And this was, again, just ahead of International Women's Day on March 8th. So they were asking for a feminism that recognizes racism among other oppressive systems, one that considers differential experiences of social and structural inequality for those who identify as women. And the minister responsible for the status of women refused to embrace intersectional feminism, saying that she believed in a more unifying brand of feminism versus one that divides. And I guess I should probably be using air quotes when I say unifying. And so that's what she said anyways. And a few weeks later, the leader of the Bloc Québécois said that intersectionality was being used by Canada as a weapon against Quebec and was attacking Quebec's values. So, and of course, not all people in Quebec think this. And there's been a really great article in Le Devoir published by Émilie Nicolas, a Black woman who's done a great job of explaining the true meaning of intersectionality. There's a great video, it's in French, and really responding and framing what's happening right now in Quebec. And so we're going to pop some of the links to that in the chat box. There's also been calls for how important this is to Quebec's Indigenous communities for intersectionality to be recognized. So on the next slide, we get to kind of more about the misuse and use of intersectionality as it might relate to our work in public health. And we talk about this in the Let's Talk quite a bit, both about why intersectionality is such a good fit for public health, which public health espouses values such as equity, social justice, solidarity, and is supposed to recognize and embrace complexity. In order to faithfully apply intersectionality and importantly, avoid widening inequalities or inequities, public health needs to both better understand intersectionality, as we've talked about, but also make a particular effort to avoid whitening and flattening intersectionality. And by that, we mean two specific things. So a whitened intersectionality is a way of invoking intersectionality to deny, and at the same time denying that systemic racism is relevant or always at play. And even if that's not explicitly said, a failure to examine whiteness says that, and a failure to connect race to larger systems of power and oppression it also does that. So an approach that may claim to be intersectional because it collects some sociodemographic data, like sex, income, and sexual orientation, could be whitened because it does not collect race-based data and overall does not consider racism and by extension, racialized experiences of other oppressive systems. A flattened intersectionality lacks a focus on power dynamics and social justice. And we do have quite a bit of work coming out in the area of power. So stay tuned to that, to the NCCDH newsletter for that. For example, an attempted intersectional approach may examine COVID-19 data by race and other factors to design, let's say, a vaccination campaign geared towards Black communities. However, if that campaign does not explicitly take into account and try to address systemic, deeply rooted barriers to vaccine uptake, including white supremacy in the health system and how it's been embedded and maintained in the health system, and how other systems of power and oppression interact to construct different levels of trust in that vaccine program, then the approach would have been flattened. If you want to think deeper about this and further, I encourage you to check out some readings. We have readings from Surma Bilge, who wrote about this in 2014, and I already mentioned Vivian May. Both of these authors are linked to from our curated list on intersectionality, which of course we'll share a link to in the chat box. There's also some readings from Ashley Christofferson, who does also cite Bilge and others in writing about how intersectionality has been whitened and misused, and we'll share a few links to her work in the chat as well. I'm going to turn it back over to Bernice for our next poll.
Great. So we have another poll question for you. Now we will be moving into discussing the application of intersectionality. So as Pemma mentioned, our next session will be focused entirely on that in terms of application, but we'll be touching on it a little bit today. So we would like to know, what is the most significant challenge you experience in applying intersectionality? Would you say it's due to a lack of knowledge about what intersectionality is? Perhaps you're unable to identify opportunities to apply it. Perhaps it's an issue related to a lack of organizational support, whether that be financially, in terms of time, in terms of prioritizing the work. Is it due perhaps to the siloed nature of your work, or is it another challenge altogether? So what would you say is the most significant challenge you experience in applying intersectionality? So we'll give you a minute or so to respond. Oh, yes, that's a great addition. So if you do select other, please feel free to provide the other in the chat box. We would love to hear what the major challenge you're facing is. Oh, so here we see reconciling quantitative methodologies with intersectionality, lack of knowledge. Yeah. Any other responses here? Resistance to change from the existing power structures, absolutely, that can be a major challenge. Resistance to change, yes, so we're seeing a lot of that. Okay, so not seeing a good demographic question or questionnaire that addresses that question. Yeah, certainly. So there's a comment here that would have been nice to select more than one option, because certainly some of these challenges can be working together. Lack of understanding of health equity, fundamental, and what success means in population health. Yeah, so certainly a range of challenges that people are experiencing. So we hope that our next session in May will give you some tools, ideas, strategies to navigate those challenges. But for now, it's really helpful for us to know some of the things that you're navigating in your daily work in terms of efforts to apply intersectionality. So thank you so much for those responses. Great, so why don't we move on to the next slide. So in terms of applying intersectionality, so now we understand a little bit about what it is, where it came from, what it means in terms of a faithful application of intersectionality, what it is and what it's not. How do we apply it? So in our document, Let's Talk Intersectionality, we provide a framework to support application. And this adapts previous work that the center has done around 4 public health roles for improving health equity. And I'm going to touch on the center circle around critical praxis, and then Pemma is going to take us through the other roles. So at the center of the framework, we see critical praxis. So can we move to the next slide, please? So critical praxis, we believe, is essential to applying intersectionality. And by critical praxis, we are referring to the ways in which theory and action should be intrinsically linked and inform one another. And that means in working to address health inequities with an intersectional approach, our thinking and theory related to the nature of social and health inequities that you can see at the left of the figure should inform our actions and vice versa. And so what that means is that our theory develops in dialogue with our practice. So as we are engaging in action to disrupt health inequities with an intersectional approach, we're also developing theory about it and thinking more deeply about it. So those 2 things need to be happening together. And reflection support and a focus on continuous reflection is crucial during that iterative process. And reflection supports organizations and practitioners to think deeply about the work they're doing and what shapes it, and to imagine and embrace new possibilities. So in our Let's Talk, we provide some strategies and ideas in terms of engaging in critical praxis. So just to provide some insights here, this involves, for example, building knowledge and understanding of intersectionality to guide thinking. So throughout the session, we provided some links and resources. So really building your knowledge is essential to this process. Topic areas as you're building your knowledge should include the origins of intersectionality, its core values and principles, as well as potential uses within public health. In addition, learning about critical race theory, which Pemma touched on, and decolonial anti-racist practice also help build essential foundational knowledge around intersectionality. Also, reflecting critically on your own social positions and identities, your biases and beliefs, and how they are shaped by systems of power and oppression is also essential as you strive to apply intersectionality. And consider how these different things, your identities, your beliefs, your positions, and how they're shaped by power and oppression, how these things work together to influence your practice. And also in dialogue with communities and groups with whom you're working, and as you grow in your understanding of intersectionality, consider areas in which your practice might need to change. Reflect on what is in your own purview to change and ways to influence changes in other areas. So that just gives you some insight in terms of what we mean when we're talking about critical praxis. And certainly at the next session, we will be expanding on that further. Now I'll pass it off to Pemma, who will be discussing applying intersectionality in greater depth.
Thanks so much, Bernice. So I'm seeing some really good comments in the chat box, and I thank you all for them. I can appreciate the many different contexts that you work in, and the sort of when you're asked to think about and apply intersectionality and multiple structures of oppression, when you work at often what feels like a very individual kind of linear system, individualized, influenced by highly biomedical models, linear system, I can appreciate that challenge. And that's why we are going to spend as much time as we can in the next session really unpacking and hearing from others who have a lot more experience of working across different public health rural areas and grappling really in real time with what it looks like to try and apply intersectionality. So stay tuned. We are going to send an email to all of you with more information about that second webinar. We're just finalizing a few things. And I hope that you can join us and bring some of this really rich discussion there as well. We're going to do some breakout groups and also hear from a panel during that webinar. Sorry, so that was a bit of an aside, but I just wanted to respond to some of what I was seeing in the chat box. We can move to the next slide, which is going to take us back to that rules framework. And like, I want to almost say, raise your hand if you haven't seen. Oh, I'm sorry, there was this one quotation here, which is in the Let's Talk, and it really gets at that critical praxis, self-reflective piece, and the importance of that. So just really underlining what Bernice was saying. We can move to the next slide. So I almost want to say, as I was saying before, raise your hand if you don't know what these roles are or if you haven't seen them, because we took these well-known public health rules framework, public health roles that are in this framework, and really mapped the idea of taking an intersectional approach onto each of these public health role areas, specifically because we've heard from you and we know that these roles are at use within your contexts, that they help to, at times, organize the way your public health organization plans its work, evaluates its work, allocates different staff and responsibilities. And of course, that's different across Canada, but we know that they're widely in use and might help to think about what would intersectionality look like if we put it on as a pair of glasses, as a sort of layer across the whole thing. So you'll see, of course, that critical praxis that Bernice spoke of as being centered and cross-cutting. I'm just going to read the roles for you in case you haven't heard of them before. You'll see assess and report, modify and orient interventions, partner with other sectors, and participate in policy development. And one of the things that's interesting is that some of these roles overlap, as they always do and always have done, but especially when you're taking an intersectionality informed approach, the roles seem to overlap even more. And that's probably part and parcel with taking an equity approach. If you really unpack what it means to take an equity approach, it's not that dissimilar to the idea that you also need to engage in that role number, if we're going to number them. The fourth role, which I think of as partnering with other sectors, is really necessary for all of the other roles. So in order to assess and report with an intersectionality approach, in order to modify and orient interventions, in order to engage in intersectionality informed policy development, all of that requires good partnerships with those in other sectors, those in community, those people with lived experience of systemic and intersectional marginalization, that role is really central and cross-cutting as well. I'll also just highlight that in the assess and report role, there's I find a deeper, more substantive wording and a recommendation to responsibly, when you put on that sort of lens of intersectionality, a deeper, more substantive wording, and a recommendation to responsibly collect, analyze, and use data. And importantly, this includes contextualizing data within larger systems and structures. So when you publish, this can mean applying critical race theory in the way that you are framing your results and interpreting your results and saying, for this racialized group experienced this health outcome because of these larger systems. And the relative advantage that you might see in another group, for example, white people, is constructed by that larger system of, or shaped by that larger system of whiteness and white supremacy. So actually giving context to the data within larger systems and structures, and substantively, I think it substantively changes the way that this role has been articulated in the past. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you haven't already taken up that role in that way, just that the way that it's been written has not said that explicitly. And so I just wanted to highlight that. I also think that taking a more intersectional approach in assessing and reporting has the potential to shift or even transform the way that health equity issues are both identified, analyzed, addressed, and by extension, how public health dollars are allocated. I've mentioned that panel a few times and that next webinar a few times, so do sign up. You can bring your stories and questions to the next webinar, or you can write us directly at NCCDH@stfx.ca or stfx.ca. And I just wanted to encourage you on the next slide, there are related readings, and the chat box has been full of extra readings that you might want to engage with. These readings especially, I think, would inform that kind of engaging in that continual critical praxis that Bernice spoke to. And so with that, we'll move to our last piece here, which is, I think, we want to ask you to engage in some reflection, but we also want to get to a question or two from you. So I'll turn it over to Bernice.
Yes, exactly. So we have some reflection questions here that we'd love for you to think about in preparation for the next session. But just to make sure that we have enough time to answer some of the great questions that you have, well, let's move to the Q&A. These reflection questions, we'll send them out after the webinar. So these are questions for you to just think about as you're getting ready for our next session. Great, so why don't we move to our question and answer time? We have about 5 minutes for that. Thank you so much for your engagement throughout the session. I believe there have been some questions related to resources and a resource list. We certainly can provide a resource list after the webinar. We also have our Let's Talk Intersectionality curated list, which we can link to in the chat if we haven't done so already. And what that curated resource list does, it provides you different resources that are grouped in different categories. So for example, we have resources related to the history of intersectionality, its roots in Black feminist theory and activism. We have resources related to its applications in public health. Yes, so I see that it's being linked to now. So you might find that helpful as you're trying to learn more about intersectionality. Wonderful.
Yeah, and I think there's a question here I see about a tool for incorporating intersectionality in policy development and program planning. Bernice, did you just touch on that, or?
I didn't touch on that. I was trying to find the link to the tool that we included within our Let's Talk, so I can do that and link to it in the chat.
Yeah, and it's also, I believe it's also in the curated list. Just to answer that question, a lot of those resources have already been gathered for you there. And part of the reason why we didn't focus on policy in this webinar is that we were trying to sort of keep it to what we could manage in this webinar. And there is space certainly to talk about policy applications in the next webinar. And there's a whole center for healthy public policy, the other NCC for healthy public policy, that with us a while ago, like 2014, 15, I can't remember exactly the dates, maybe 16, put together a webinar on applying intersectionality to policy analysis. And we can share that past webinar with you as well. It's in the curated list as well. So, I think I'm just looking at the other comments here and seeing this. There was an interesting comment that I just want to highlight here about asking how the term intersectionality fits with First Nations and Métis views of the world. It seems like a good way to analyze oppressive colonial structures, but what language would make sense from an Indigenous perspective to describe this reality? I have heard many First Nations and Métis groups not resonate with this language. So I personally don't feel like I can answer that on behalf of the of the globality of the question. I do think that there is a good discussion likely to be had there, and language is always, it might be that the language does not resonate, but that the idea of multiple systems of oppression and examining structural inequality and centering colonialism in that discussion, it does resonate. Again, I don't think I can answer with an exact question or speak on behalf of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit groups, of course. But I do think it's worth unpacking that more. And I thank the person, I believe it was Josh, who brought that question up. We did share a piece of literature on red intersectionality, a resource related to that by an Indigenous author in BC on that topic, or somewhat related. And I think that we can also bring some of that thinking to the next webinar. And so thanks for that question. If there's anything else that you think that we might be able to respond to, Bernice, in the next webinar, we can highlight it here. Otherwise, I think we're out of time. And so I'll move us to the next slide. Anything else, Bernice?
That's it for me for today.
Okay, I just wanted to thank everybody so much for coming here. Thank you to my co-presenter, Bernice. Thank you for the presence, the willingness to lean in. And also I want to encourage you to fill out our evaluation, because we really do rely on you to build our knowledge of how these webinars are supporting you to think about these issues and your work, what more we could have brought to it, what you're still thinking about, what concrete actions you are looking to change, or how would this maybe affect how you do your work in the next little while. So we really look forward to hearing your responses. Thank you for being with us. We hope to see you again on May 3rd.